There is a place in Wyoming where people drive for hours to photograph something that looks exactly like a tree stump. Not vaguely, not if you try to see it that way, but structurally, precisely, in a way that becomes uncomfortable the longer you look at it. The vertical columns, the ring-like banding near the base, and the flat, slightly concave top all match what remains when wood decays and only the compressed core is left behind. And once that clicks, it's hard to go back to seeing it as just rock. The Park Service calls it a volcanic plug, an igneous intrusion formed by magma cooling beneath the surface and later exposed by erosion. That explanation is technically correct because basalt does form columns and erosion does remove surrounding material over time. But that explanation doesn't touch the part that feels wrong when you're standing in front of it. It explains the material, but not the shape. The formation is known as Devil's Tower, and it rises out of the Wyoming plains completely alone with no mountain range, no volcanic field, and no visible system connected to it. Every other volcanic structure of this kind sits inside a larger context, surrounded by evidence of the process that formed it. This one doesn't, and the standard answer is that everything else eroded away. That might be true, but it leaves behind a very specific kind of silence, because erosion removes material, but it doesn't usually leave something this intact. At the base of the tower, the ground is covered with broken columns of the same material scattered outward, as if something separated and fell away from a central structure. Rangers refer to those fallen pieces as logs, which sounds like casual language until you realize the term keeps showing up in older geological notes. It's treated as descriptive, not important, something you're not supposed to follow too far, but it's hard not to once you notice it. And this is where it starts to get uncomfortable, because it doesn't stop with one formation. The same column structures appear at the Giant's Causeway in Northern Ireland, where over 40,000 interlocking pillars rise from the ground with near-perfect consistency. They appear again in Scotland, Iceland, Sicily and Tasmania, separated by oceans, but showing the same geometry, the same proportions, the same internal structure, repeating over and over again. Each site has its own explanation, and every explanation works on its own, but the pattern doesn't behave like separate events. Because natural processes produce variation, they reflect differences in pressure, temperature, and local conditions that create irregular outcomes. What shows up here is repetition not identical in every detail, but consistent enough that it starts to feel like the same thing happening more than once. And when something repeats like that, the explanation usually sits above the individual cases, not inside them. That's the part that doesn't get explored, because each formation is studied in isolation, labeled explained, and then left alone, which keeps the pattern from ever fully forming. But once you start placing them side by side, the similarities become harder to dismiss, especially when the same small details keep showing up. The flat tops, the vertical structure, the outward debris, none of them prove anything on their own, but together they start to feel less random. And then there's the scale, because once you move beyond individual structures and look at entire regions, the numbers stop feeling comfortable. The Deccan Traps in India cover over 200,000 square miles with layers of rock thousands of feet thick, forming one of the largest geological structures on Earth. The accepted explanation is volcanic activity over time, and that explanation works, but it's not the only one that fits the pattern. That's where things start to slip a little. Because layered compression produces the same result. Lower layers, older upper layers, younger, exactly what you would expect from something settling over time. Both explanations match the data, but only one is ever really explored, and that's usually where it ends. Not because the other option is impossible, but because it doesn't fit inside the current framework. And frameworks are hard to step outside of. Once you reach that point, the question stops being about whether any one formation looks unusual. It becomes about why so many of them look like the same thing and why that thing is never considered as a category. And once that question forms, it doesn't really go away, because now you're not just looking at rock anymore, you're looking at something that might still be carrying the structure of what it used to be. And the only reason that sounds extreme is because of the scale. Once you stop looking at just the shape and start looking at what it would take for something like this to exist, the problem shifts, and it gets harder to ignore. Because the Earth has already supported life at scales that feel impossible by today's standards, and that part is not controversial. It's recorded in fossil evidence, in atmospheric data, and in biological models that all point to a very different set of limits than the ones we're used to. And once you accept that the question isn't whether scale existed, it's how far it actually went. Around 300 million years ago, during the Carboniferous period, atmospheric oxygen levels reached roughly 35% compared to about 21% today. That change had direct physical consequences. Insects grew to sizes that seem unrealistic now, with dragonflies over 2 feet across and arthropods stretching several feet long. That scaling isn't random, it follows a simple relationship between oxygen availability and biological size, and once that relationship is real, it applies to everything, not just insects. Because oxygen doesn't appear without a source, photosynthesis produces it, which means something had to be generating that oxygen at a scale large enough to sustain it globally. The standard explanation is vast. Swamp forests, tree-like plants around 100 to 150 feet tall spread densely across the planet. That explanation works on paper, but when you actually run the numbers, something doesn't fully close. To maintain a 35% oxygen atmosphere, the density of those forests would need to be extreme, far beyond anything we see in modern ecosystems. That's usually solved by adjusting variables, more density, longer duration, wider distribution, until the model holds together. But even then, it sits right on the edge of what's considered plausible. And when a model sits on the edge like that, it usually means there's another possibility that isn't being explored, because there are only 2 ways to solve that equation. Either the planet was covered in forests far denser than anything we can realistically model, or the organisms producing that oxygen were larger than we currently assume. The first option stays inside the system, so it's the one that gets used. The second option steps outside it, so it doesn't get discussed, even though it fits the same data. Now bring that back to the formations. There's a process in geology called permineralization, where organic material is slowly replaced by minerals while preserving its internal structure. Petrified wood is the simplest example, entire trees turned to stone, but still holding the patterns of what they used to be. That process is real, measurable, and happens under the right conditions over long periods of time. What's almost never talked about is that the process doesn't care about size. Permineralization works on structure, not scale, which means if something larger existed and the conditions were right, it would undergo the same transformation. The result would look exactly like rock chemically and visually, but still carry the structural memory of what it replaced. And once it's classified as rock, that's where the investigation usually stops. That's where the assumption locks in. Because we don't look for biological origin in something that's already been labelled geological, even if the structure itself doesn't fully behave like standard rock formation. The label answers the question before the question is fully asked. And once that happens, the pattern becomes much harder to see. Now look again at what keeps repeating. Flat or slightly concave tops, circular bases, vertical internal columns, and debris fields of the same material scattered outward from a central point. Each of those features has an explanation on its own, and none of them are unusual individually. But when they show up together repeatedly across multiple formations, they start to behave like a system instead of separate events. and systems don't usually form by coincidence. One anomaly can be ignored, two can be dismissed, but repetition at this level starts to narrow the number of explanations that actually fit. The more times the same structure appears, the more the explanation has to stretch to keep treating each case as unrelated. And when the explanation starts stretching, that's usually where something important is being missed. At this point, nothing has been proven, and that matters because this isn't about jumping to a conclusion. It's about noticing that the pattern exists and that the pattern doesn't fully fit inside the explanation we've been given. And once you see that, it's difficult to go back to seeing each formation as completely independent, because now the question isn't just about what these structures are, it's about whether they're all versions of the same thing, and whether that thing was ever supposed to be this small. Once you stop looking at the surface and start paying attention to how these structures are connected to what surrounds them, the pattern shifts again, and this is where it becomes harder to keep everything inside the same explanation. Because what matters now is not just the shape above ground, but what extends outward from the base. And in certain formations, that extension does something it's not supposed to do. Shiprock in New Mexico is one of the clearest examples of this. It rises out of a flat desert plain as a single vertical structure, officially described as a volcanic neck, the hardened core of an ancient volcano exposed after erosion removed everything around it. That explanation accounts for the central tower, but it doesn't fully explain what spreads out from it. Radiating from the base are long, thin walls of rock called dikes, extending outward for miles in multiple directions. The standard explanation is that magma forced its way through cracks during an eruption, cooled, and was later exposed as the surrounding material eroded away. That explanation works if you look at it quickly, but the geometry introduces a detail that doesn't sit quite right. The dikes don't just extend outward, they extend outward and slightly downward from the central structure. And that directional shift is not a small detail, because magma doesn't usually behave that way. When magma moves through rock, it follows paths of least resistance, spreading along existing planes, not cutting downward away from its source in a consistent radial pattern. What appears here looks less like something that erupted outward and more like something that anchored into the ground below. And once that possibility enters the picture, the structure starts to read differently, because downward radial patterns are not random. They are characteristic of systems that connect into something beneath them, systems that extend from a central body into a supporting structure below the surface. That doesn't prove anything on its own, but it shifts the interpretation enough that the original explanation starts to compete with it instead of fully containing it. Now place that next to everything else. Flat-topped formations with circular bases, vertical column structures, outward debris fields, and now radial extensions that move downward instead of outward. Each feature still has an explanation individually, but together they begin to form a configuration that doesn't behave like separate geological events. It starts to look like parts of a single system that has been reduced to fragments, and that's where the idea of removal stops sounding abstract. Because if something once extended both upward and downward from a central point, and only the central portion remains, the result would look exactly like this. The upper structure would be gone, the lower extensions partially preserved, and the central core would remain as the most stable element. That is not a conclusion, but it is a pattern that fits the structure more cleanly than treating each piece as unrelated. At this point, the strongest argument against this is still that every part can be explained independently, and that remains true within the current model. But the more these features align across different locations, the harder it becomes to treat that alignment as coincidence. Because independent explanations do not usually produce the same structural relationships over and over again without some shared cause. And that shared cause is where the tension increases. Because if these structures are not isolated, but fragments of something larger, then what we are looking at is incomplete by definition. It is not the full system. It is what remains after something changed, after something was removed or reduced to the point where only the most stable parts survived. And that interpretation does not require new evidence. It only requires connecting what is already visible. That's the moment where the question changes again, because it is no longer about whether these formations can be explained one by one. It becomes about whether they make more sense as pieces of something that is no longer here. By the time the pattern becomes clear, the most difficult part is not finding the evidence, but realizing it was never missing in the first place. These structures are documented, measured, photographed, and studied in detail, and every part of them has already been described. The problem is not that they are hidden, but that they are separated, each one placed into a category that explains it just enough to stop the question. And once that happens, the pattern never fully forms. Scientific models are designed to stabilize understanding, not to constantly reopen it. When something is labeled as volcanic, every feature is interpreted through that lens, and anything that doesn't quite fit is adjusted until it does. That process is not suppression, it is how systems maintain consistency over time. But consistency comes at a cost, because once an explanation exists, alternative interpretations are rarely tested with the same intensity. That's why this stays where it is. Devil's Tower is volcanic, Shiprock is volcanic. The Giant's Causeway is volcanic, each one explained, categorized, and left in place. The similarities are acknowledged, but never assembled into a single system, because doing that would require stepping outside the framework that defines them. And frameworks are not built to question themselves. But the limitation is not in the structures, it's in how they're grouped. Because once you place them side by side, without the labels, the similarities stop feeling like coincidence and start feeling like repetition. The same vertical structures, the same flat or concave tops, the same outward debris, the same radial extensions, all appearing in different locations that are supposed to be unrelated. And when that many features align, the explanation starts to feel smaller than what it's trying to describe. At that point, the question shifts one final time, because it's no longer about whether the current explanation is wrong. It becomes about whether it is complete. And completeness is where the model becomes uncertain. Because if something existed at a scale larger than what we currently accept, and it underwent processes like mineralization, erosion, and structural collapse, the result would look exactly like what we are seeing now. It would not require new evidence to exist, only a different way of connecting the evidence that is already there. And once that possibility is considered, it becomes difficult to look at these structures the same way again. That doesn't mean the alternative is proven. It means it hasn't been tested, and untested ideas don't disappear, they just sit outside the system waiting to be examined. The technology exists to analyze composition, structure, and formation history in detail, and it has been used extensively within the current framework. But it has almost never been used to test whether these formations could originate from something other than what they are assumed to be. And that gap is where the entire question still sits, because once a model answers a question, it rarely asks a new one. And when that happens, the only thing left is what you can still see. If this perspective changes the way you look at these structures, even slightly, then that's where this starts. This is Tartaria Revealed, where the focus is not on rejecting what is known, but on looking at what has never been fully connected. Because sometimes the missing piece isn't new information, it's recognizing what's been there the entire time.